إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستهديه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فهو المهتد ومن يضلل فلن تجد له وليا مرشدا وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما. قال الله تعالى في كتابه العزيز بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله لا يغير ما بقوم حتى يغيروا ما بأنفسهم. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, all praise is due to Allah, Lord of the worlds, and we ask Him to send His greatest peace and blessings upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, upon his family and his companions, and upon all the believers until the Day of Judgment. Ya Rabbil Alameen. Allah says in the Quran what means in English, Allah does not change what is in the people until they change what is in themselves. One of the common things we find in today's society is a call for change. A call for us to improve the circumstances and situations that people find themselves in. But what we often realize and forget, or rather what we often forget, is that change has to begin within ourselves. We can't call for something for somebody else to change until we can change the very thing which is in our hearts. Because change isn't words. Change isn't something you say for people to do. But change is something that people observe in you and want some of that thing. Influencer marketing has become one of the biggest industries for companies marketing their products. All because of the idea that when people see something in someone else, they want it themselves. Allah Azza wa Jal, when He talks about change, He talks about change within ourselves. Change within what we ourselves are confronting and facing before we can affect the society around us. In modern research, people have observed that you need between 3 to 5% of a population to begin to observe a behavior before that begins to affect the rest of society. Small amounts of people, increments, individuals, who adopt a particular reality for themselves, it begins to perpetuate and perpetuate around society. We live in a day and age where so much is happening around the world. People are protesting in America around the Black Lives Matter. COVID has locked people down in their homes. The economy is at the verge of complete collapse, had it not been for the governments keeping them up. And it's times like these that it's important that we begin to reflect how we as a community embody the realities that we want people to go forwards in their own realities going forwards. It's with this spirit that I began to speak with some friends the other day. It was a gathering of women and men, and we were discussing some of the realities and things we've found since COVID has happened and how the lockdown has brought that reality home. During this, I kind of began to talk about how it's during this lockdown, I've begun to realize how many blessings we have, how many privileges we've realized that we had before that only have become manifest today. Meeting family was something you'd never think about being unable to do, and suddenly it's been taken away from us. Going to the shops, eating in a restaurant, visiting the masjid. Many of the simple things that we took almost for granted have been taken away from us. And it's only after it's been taken away that we begin to realize just how fortunate we were in having them. At that time I noticed and I began to speak about how, for myself, I noticed that when we build local communities and when we build our own communities around us, that we can begin to talk to people, we can begin to speak to people online, that we begin to notice change. It was at that point that one of the sisters spoke up, and she said something that I'd never thought about before. Whilst I was calling people to build their communities, work in their communities, engage in their communities, she said to me something that I will never forget. She said, that reality for you is possible because you're a man. And as a man, you're welcome to engage in a mosque. You're welcome to be part of a board. You're welcome just to simply enter a masjid and pray. But as a female, that opportunity is not open to me. That privilege is not there. And at that moment, I realized the fact that I'm a man was a blessing in a sense that I never realized how many barriers are being placed so unfortunately in front of our women. I realized how much of a blessing my own community was in Solihull. That men and women are free to engage, and we've always had female teachers in our Sunday school, female spaces in our prayer rooms, female spaces in the masjid. Something that I thought was normal turned out not to be. And that question that was thrown up sparked a beginning of reflections upon my own life. How many things I've been given that I'm completely unaware of, that other people have been taken from them, and they don't have that privilege. Such that, number one, I should begin with gratitude for Allah Azza wa Jal that I don't face such barriers and such difficulties. But number two, how unfortunate that someone so talented as this lady and many of our women are prevented from contributing because of these completely ludicrous and irrational barriers. We see the protests of Black Lives Matter, protests that have taken the streets globally. UK, US, France, not a single place except universally our black brothers and sisters have taken to the streets to describe what they say is systematic discrimination, what they have experienced in the way people look at them, in the way people see them, in the way people view them. A reality that I have never experienced myself. Being of a lighter complexion, I often don't have to think twice about the way people view me, but yet every single day they describe how people view them to be rebellious, to be negative, to be guilty before even speaking a word. And the death of George Floyd epitomizes how somebody, before he was even convicted of anything, before he could even speak, being held against his will, with his neck being pressed by the knee of those who were meant to protect him, lost his life. This privilege is something that we have experienced, that we have felt, either as an Asian, as a white person, as an Arab. Something which our black brothers and sisters face every single day and potentially lose their lives as a consequence of this. So how do we as a community begin to address this? And this is where the circle comes round to how we begun this khutbah. Realizing that Allah does not change the condition of a people until they change the condition of themselves. Before we do anything externally, we have to look internally. We have to acknowledge the very painful realities that the black Muslims in our community have to face, that the darker skinned people in our community have to face. We have to acknowledge the very real reality that we favour people who are fairer skinned. We see it as a beauty, an archetype of ideal kind of complexions for people to have. We have to face the very real reality that for many people, if a person comes and proposes to their daughter who is not of their same caste or their same race, they'll reject them. If your daughter is happy with the man, and the man is happy for your daughter to marry her, or vice versa, your son is happy to marry the girl, and the girl is happy to marry your son, and the person has no religious issues or character issues within them. The Prophet ﷺ described, if you do not do this, تَكُنْ فِتْنَةٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَفَسَادٌ كَبِيرٌ. If you do not allow the person, when he said, مَنْ اسْتَطَاعَ مِنْكُمُ الْبَاءَةَ فَلْيَتَزَوَّجْ, when a person has the ability to get married. And in another hadith he described, when a person comes to marry your daughter, then marry her. If he's إِذَا جَاءَكُم مَّن تَرْضَوْنَ دِينَهُ وَخُلُقَهُ فَزَوَّجُوهُ. If you find someone who's come to you and you're pleased, you're happy with their religion and their character, then marry them. Because if you don't, there will be great tribulation. تَكُنْ فِتْنَةٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ. A great tribulation, a great calamity, chaos that's spread, وَفَسَادٌ كَبِيرٌ, and a large amount of injustice. Until we rectify what is in our own communities, until we realize our own privileges and our own prejudices, we can never truly affect society. Now, a common question at this point, but what about those people in Palestine? What about those people in Syria? That very question is indicative of the discrimination that we've embodied within ourselves. Over 40% of Muslims in America are black. This is a Muslim issue. Palestinians are Muslim and Christian and all sorts, just like the black community in America. And an injustice against anybody is an injustice against all. The fact that we feel the need to create an us and them archetype, the fact that we feel the need to suggest that we have to be speaking about Palestinians, speaking about Syrians, who of course are massively persecuted. Those in Kashmir are being persecuted. Those in Yemen are being persecuted. But the fact that we choose to raise this whenever an issue rises in our homegrown soil, in our own issues, in our own background, shows the prejudices that we've embodied within ourselves. Shows the mindset that we don't even realize that these are our very own brothers and sisters. And even if they were not, even if they were all non-Muslims, does this make this cause any less worthy? Did the Prophet ﷺ, when he was in Mecca, preaching for people to accept Islam, witnessing the injustice that people perpetrated against their slavery, did he say, we will only care for those black slaves that are Muslim? We will only care for those poor people that are Muslim? Of course not. The Prophet ﷺ spoke universally, and that was his appeal. Amongst the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, many of the great companions, so many so that you probably were unaware that they were even black. Thus was how important and how colorblind the Prophet ﷺ and the companions were to one another. The Prophet ﷺ, his companion Ammar ibn Yasir, a great companion who suffered tremendous torture and punishment in Mecca, a person the Prophet ﷺ said on his death, he will be in the army that is just. He will be martyred and he'll be fighting in an army that are on the correct side. He was a dark skin complexion. Julaybib, a companion who the Prophet ﷺ wept for when he died in the Battle of Uhud, having been recently married, of dark complexion. Usama ibn Zayd, Ayman. Ayman was the mother after the mother of the Prophet ﷺ. There for him when he was born and there at the point he died. The only person who accompanied him throughout the entirety of his life was a black lady. The Prophet ﷺ was nurtured by Allah Azza wa Jal. His character was taught by Allah Azza wa Jal, and nowhere in that character did it say passively or explicitly to discriminate against anyone of colour. If we want to see change in our society, we have to begin to adopt the change within ourselves. We have to begin to have uncomfortable conversations that we as a community must begin to address. Because as Muslims, we are meant to be at the forefront of calling for justice. We're meant to be at the forefront of calling people to Allah Azza wa Jal. And if we ourselves suffer from these issues, then we ourselves will never be able to get past them. We'll never be able to preach to those who are looking at us. Imagine people walk into a masjid and see a mosque board made up of black, whites and Asians. Something that's so normal, it almost becomes just the accepted reality. No need to divide a masjid into a Somali masjid, a masjid into a Pakistani masjid, a masjid into an Arab masjid. We have, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately, masajid in Birmingham that are divided in such a way. I was once invited to raise funds for a mosque, a Sri Lankan masjid. And I was genuinely giving money thinking the money will be going to a masjid in Sri Lanka. Only to learn that this was a Sri Lankan community masjid. As though only those who are Sri Lankan can have the privileges to pray there. And this isn't discriminating against Sri Lankans. This is a problem that's endemic within our folds and our ranks. One of the things I was very fortunate to grow up with, and a point my father made to me over and over again, is that we had over 23 different ethnicities. We would actively ensure that our boards were representative of different places and different people and different colours. I remember explicitly selecting, not myself, but the community selecting somebody who would be Bengali, somebody who would be Pakistani, somebody who would be white convert, somebody who was from every single race. We even had our fellow brothers from Afro-Caribbeans represented within the community. How many of us can genuinely walk into our mosque boards and see that representation? When we think of Muslim countries, do we think of West Africa? A place where the vast majority of Muslims, the vast majority of people are Muslims. From Nigeria to Mauritania to many of those regions. Many of them have a significant, if not the majority of their population as Muslim. The Senegal and the Gambia have hosted some of the greatest Muslim scholars over the centuries. How many of us have even go to that region when we talk about the Muslim community and Muslim scholarship? Now one person may say, but isn't it true that we are only commenting on the realities we see? Isn't it true that we observe this behavior amongst black people who are causing riots, causing havoc, and we're just calling that out? The reality is only explained to you when you travel to a country that is different. Now, many of us would have travelled abroad when travelling abroad was permissible. We'd go to Morocco or to Egypt and we'd come to buy something. And suddenly we'd find the price inflated 100, 200 times the original price. Perplexed, we were like, what? How can you cheat us in this way? How can you charge such an inflated price to us? And they said, but you're a foreigner. You're all rich. That instance is a type of discrimination where people lump you into a category because you're an identifiable minority. In another example, when I travelled myself to Tanzania, a country which is across the coast of East Africa, because of the complexion that I am, I was clearly different to everyone else. Now in that instant, if I had arrived and I begun to do anything, good or bad, because of the few numbers of people like me in that area, my actions begin to become exemplified, begin to become amplified, such that you notice them more than you notice everything else. In economics and behavioral theory, we discuss this as a cognitive bias. A reality that when you have purchased something, you begin to observe that thing over and over again. As an example, they give, if somebody, and this happened to me, when you purchase your first car, let's say you purchased a Renault Megane. Suddenly, as you're driving, you begin to notice there are a lot of people who have Renault Meganes. You begin to notice the very thing that you've observed because of the experience that you've had. You begin to notice lots of people driving them, not because anything has changed from today since yesterday, apart from the fact that you yourself have experienced something that allowed you to observe something that you previously missed. When we look at our own communities, and people make the argument, but isn't it true that people are looting and breaking crimes, that they are black? The response is, look at the data. Look at the actual statistics. Who is more likely to be carrying a knife? Who is more likely to be part of a gang? Who is more likely to perpetuate crime? And you will see time and time again, the data is more skewed to those people who are of white complexion than of those who are black. But why do we notice it amongst people who are black? It's because they are not the majority in this country. They are not the people who make up the most. So when you observe something, because it's different to how you've observed it, that's what stands out. Again, speaking to our own privileges. You become suspicious of things that you're unaware of, you're afraid of. So what things can we do to begin to change this reality? We're seeing people suffering across the world due to the racism that they faced. Our own Muslim brothers from the black community are suffering and are struggling because of this racism. The first thing we have to do is we have to become introspective. Whether it's the example I gave of females in the community, whether it's examples I gave of black people in the community, we have to begin to notice the very blessings we have in that we're not exposed to the same trials and tribulations. Begin to sit down and list the amount of gifts that you've had. In last week's Khutbah, I discussed about blessings in a positive light, talking about all the gifts Allah has given you. In the hikam, in the wisdoms of Ibn Ata'illah, he says, if those who will not come to Allah through His blessings will be brought to Him through the shackles of tribulation. When you can recognize the blessings that you've been given, things you may be completely unaware of, then you can begin to truly empathize with those who are facing it. The second, after beginning to realize our own issues, it's very important to begin to discuss this within our communities, to begin to discuss this within our families. What words do we use to describe black people in our community? I remember once in a conversation, somebody was describing a dish, a cooking dish, and it was called Ras al-Abd, which means the head of a slave. And I was genuinely perplexed. I said, why, what makes it a slave? And they go, because it's a black thing. It's coloured black. And I physically felt sick. How can you call something the head of a black, or the head of a slave, insinuating that black people are slaves? And this is a dish within our cuisine, something I've purchased in shops. We have to begin to have the conversation to say that this is not right, this is not acceptable. When we think of people of colour, do we think the fairer the skin, the more beautiful they are? The litmus test is if somebody was to come to you with a proposal for work, for business, for marriage, Would the colour of their skin affect the trust that you have in them? If we can begin to have these conversations, we can begin to change things for the better. Because change only comes when you realise, then begin to bring to yourself to account for the damage and the prejudices that you have inside. So the first, become introspective. Begin to list and think about the issues that you're facing. Number 2, begin the conversation. Begin to talk with those around you to address issues that they are probably unaware of, largely because they've never faced them. If we can make people aware of these issues, we can begin to resolve them for those who suffer from them. And then finally, begin to be proactive in the community, calling for representation of people of colour, of people of different genders within the boards and bodies that represent us. These protests that are going on should be an issue for all of us, because a significant percentage of our community, of our global Muslim community, suffer from these problems. And the Prophet ﷺ described that the Muslim Ummah is like a body. When a single part of it is injured, all of it feels the pain. I myself can never truly understand what it's like to have grown up black in this country. But because of that inability to understand, we should begin to have the conversations with those who've suffered. And we should take a proactive approach in ensuring representation and ensuring discrimination is removed from our hearts and from our communities. Once we as a community can embody this, once we can acknowledge that this problem exists in our community in order to change the ways that we are, then our community becomes the reality in which it changes, the reality in which people's hearts will turn. I leave you with the words of the great Malcolm X, Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, a man who suffered some of the greatest suffering as a consequence of his colour of his skin, and a man who spent his life calling upon the equality of races. A man who called himself a Muslim, and in that journey of sincerity, Allah guided him to the true path. The thing which tipped him from unorthodox to orthodox Sunni Islam, making him one of the greatest saints that we've had in the last century, was his travel on the pilgrimage of Hajj. A pilgrimage which, no matter who you are, you wear the same 2 robes of white thobes, white cloths. And no matter who you are, you stand on the plains of Arafah with no special privileges and no difference between anyone and the other. It was the lived reality of equality that he experienced in Hajj that allowed him to see the power that Islam can have in transforming a person's life. It was that experience, that lived reality, that transformed his life. Now imagine if we can make that reality to all those around us. If we can genuinely extend the arm of friendship, if we can ensure representation in our community, and we can ensure that Black Lives Matter, that our black brothers and sisters, Muslim and non-Muslim, are part and parcel of us. And we feel their pain as much as we feel the pain of any other country that's suffering. May Allah ennoble us and guide our community to allow us to turn to Him and return to Him and embody the very character and meanings of the Prophet ﷺ and the community that he lived in, that was truly colourblind, that allowed anybody of any colour to rise to the greatest ranks. May Allah allow and improve the situation for our black brothers and sisters, allowing us to overcome this stench of racism, as the Prophet ﷺ described it. He said, "If innaha mumtina, leave it. This tribalism, this racism that you face, it's stinky, it's smelly, leave it." May Allah allow us to really understand these issues and what they face, allow us to empathize and allow us to transform to help make things better for them. Of course, unfortunately, this is not a real Jum'ah Salah. This is a khutbah in place of the Jum'ah Salah to fill the void of not having one. So you'll have to stand up and pray your 4 rak'ahs of Dhuhr, and inshallah, Allah will reward you as though you prayed the khutbah, because you had the intention. Had the mosques been open, had the lockdown not been there, you would have prayed the Jum'ah. This is again from the piety of the hearts. So Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much. أقول قولي هذا استغفر الله لي ولكم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.